So I wanted to make a few comments and pose them in the form of some questions, and I know Jeff has a couple as well. But we really want this to be involving the audience too. So have a low threshold for jumping in, especially late in the day. One of the things I wanted to say, I mean, I thought they were both great talks, and it's not just the culture of the being in the psychology side of things, just my personal valuing response of these. And I want to make a comment that came up in Brian's talk that I think is relevant to both, and certainly my thinking, and that is how do we put, I think the way you word it is how do we put together the cognitive and affective dimensions, and I would add social dimensions. And I think that as we really try to consider the real world, especially health relevant impact of behavior change and how to move the science forward, I think we really need to think about decision making in these complex ways where the valuing systems of young people, adolescents, across the age span, are not just doing simple computational models like the economists wish that they were doing, and again, as they clearly acknowledge, they know the limitations, but the idea of what is being valued isn't just constrained by the circumstances, whether it's raining and you value an umbrella, but they're really not just constrained, but they really shift for complex reasons related to the basic part of these valuing systems. And I think that as we consider the social neuroscience dimension and social behavioral dimensions, especially in adolescence, the idea of what we value at a fast affective processing level and how learning and social learning sculpts these valuing systems in really powerful ways, such as being competitive, such as how much you value being admired, such as whether you engage challenges, such as you respond to stress in a way that you engage and energize your responses or decisions, or whether you retreat. I think that thinking of some of the complexities of these systems and the social dimensions are really, really important parts of putting together these really sophisticated cognitive models, affective and I think social, and particularly as we think about how these develop. And so I wanted to take that and come back to some of the questions that came up from this wonderful consideration of the differences in competitiveness. And some of the things that you highlighted at the end of your talk is really where I want to focus for a moment, following that framework, because I think part of what you were saying is that I think the way you worded it is that, thinking about what are the correlates, what psychological traits correlate with competitiveness that may contribute to how different genders develop these, different cultures influence these. And I wanted to just take that a step in the direction of some of the work that we've been doing in terms of what changes in adolescence, what changes at puberty. And one idea is that the degree to which people like challenge, the degree to which they like some mixed state of fear and reward anticipation, that's excitement, that's thrilling. The individual differences in liking that, we call it sensation seeking. We say that kids at puberty increase their sensation seeking. They like a feeling state that lots of other individuals don't like. And I think this tendency to enjoy challenge, to have some mix of risk and competition and find that appealing, may not just be some psychological trait. It may be a basic quality of these valuing systems. And so I think that, and I want to take this back to a very practical level, and then I'll end with this, try to open this up into general discussion. So for example, when you think of these, we'll take the girls for example, in the Dutch system, and how their behavior, choosing the tournament, is a predictor of the degree to which they are going to choose the high prestige track. The assumption is, and I could share it, that the high prestige track is a better track. But that's implying that you value prestige. If you value literature, or you have been admired for doing literature well and being creative, or you have found it rewarding to be cooperative and connect with people who like creativity, you may not value, quote, prestige in the same way. And if those coding systems for value of prestige are different, then it may correlate to not liking to choose tournaments and not liking a prestige track. It still could constrain people in ways we wouldn't like. And then finally, not to reduce things to mechanisms, but there's a fascinating story here from the adolescent development in both boys and girls, that testosterone in both sophisticated animal studies and in boys and girls reward response increases not just responses to reward and parts of the dopamine system with reward and motivation, but social status relevant aspects of reward. The willingness to trade off money for prestige. And there are really interesting reasons that would happen as you become reproductively mature. Whether that's cultural interaction with what gets admired or the hormone receptors themselves, that could lead to some of these changes. So those are sort of comments that I think, again, broaden the questions, both the slice you're taking and the competitiveness. And I love that you have the developmental psychology dimension, but also thinking not just about monetary rewards, but these valuing systems in more complex social ways.
Okay, so let me start answering the question. Many questions. So the first comment is there are not many studies who have looked at this from 3-year-olds to 18-year-olds, but the one study that did it found that, at least in Western Europe, the difference is there for 3-year-olds and persists for 18-year-olds. So we don't find a big jump with adolescents. Now, some people looked at specific regions in India, so there they found differences. But so it's not completely, so we don't really know yet is the answer. But I wouldn't be surprised if the differences are there very early and not exacerbated at puberty. But it would have been an option. But I don't think it's the case. But I think we need to understand it more. There's one study that looks at old people, and they seem to suggest that among really old people, the gender gap disappears, but then you worry a bit about selection. So that is the same problem, that once you have old people, the problem is, we can't, for school children it's easy, we go to school, we get everybody, but we can't do this the same thing for other populations. When thinking about prestige, so one way to think of it would be to say, I choose a certain track because I'm just interested in this topic, or I choose it because I want to be, well, it's a prestigious choice. I want to be somebody who does things that are difficult and maybe going to make me a lot of money later. If it would be just preferences, I would not expect any correlation with competitiveness. So I think it's not just preferences. Even for the girls, we find this correlation with the competitiveness. We also have, we ask them for themselves what they think where the best kids go, and you can use that ranking, and the results are not that changed. But I agree. I think to some extent it does measure how much I want to, I think sensation seeking is probably going to be related to this. Probably also how much I value being viewed as somebody who is prestigious. But in our experiment, we're actually very careful to try to get rid of that as much as possible, in the sense that nobody knows your choices. So everything is, apart from us, very anonymous. And we actually don't know you because we just pay you at the end something, but we have actually no idea about these children per se. I'm not sure. I kind of keep forgetting that.
So I just want to make one other comment, and then I'm interested in Jeff and Brian's comments on this. And that is that part of the model of these valuing systems and how they may be shaped by early learning and sex differences early, and then cultural influences, and then as well as puberty, is not just how people would respond if you ask them verbally what they value, but appetitive motivational systems that are shaped in these ways. And so if there are individual differences, both through these biologic differences and learning, that change the gain of the appetitive drive for status, then I can imagine that, separate from preferences, leaving the language aside, that having a strong dial on this appetite for being admired, getting status, for whatever set of reasons, genetic, hormones, et cetera, and then shaped by learning, that could lead to choosing tournaments, finding challenges engaging, and seeking prestigious choices. Even if you liked literature more, you might go for the prestigious choice. So it could, separate from what people would report, I think that this appetitive drive hunger for. I mean, those are metaphors, but I think it's really those neural systems more than computationally thinking about what you like and want and goals. I think it's the intensification of these appetitive systems.
So I agree. I think we can, in that sense, one way to think of this is to say that we can kind of teach girls to be competitive, or we can actually, maybe we can instill in them this hunger for for admiration. Because when you look at the choices of boys and girls, you find that the boys' choices were much more aligned with their competitiveness than the girls' choices, which suggests that the girls' choices are aligned with other things, maybe actually how much they like literature. Whereas for the boys, the only thing that matters is how competitive they are, basically. And if you are ambitious then or competitive, then you go to the math track, period, because that's where the best kids go. Whereas for the girls, it's like, well, maybe I am, but maybe I'm not. Maybe I want to be just, stay at home with my children, and it kind of doesn't matter. I might as well just do what I like. Now, the problem is that means that afterwards, that's indeed going to be your option, right? Because you're not going to be able to study engineering anymore or something. So I think thinking about how we can shape these drives that seem to be so important, or how we can change the institution to make it maybe less important. So I think these are really important questions, and that we have neglected a lot so far. I wish I would know the answer.
This is probably, way up here, and I'm talking at this level, or even that level, right? But the way that the system, what's amazing, I think, about these findings is that there is some common valuation mechanism in the brain that you can jack into with something as arbitrary as money. Think about it. Money is a crystallization of social value. If we were airlifted into the jungle of New Guinea and I offered you a $100 bill or a Bowie knife, you'd choose the Bowie knife. The $100 bill would just be ugly paper. The fact that we're reprogrammed to have our very deep subcortical, expected value circuitry to respond to this stuff is remarkable. It suggests that it's incredibly socially malleable and reprogrammable, and not just, over a long time, but if I change the norms, then suddenly maybe I'm valuing a whole different way of interacting with other people and resources that I want to get. So it's really like the Wild West right now. I think a lot of assumptions you might have had going into this field have been turned upside down. So for instance, when we first started to try to publish this stuff about monetary cues activating the nucleus accumbens, reviewers said, well, that's not possible because, you should be hitting the cortex first. You should be hitting symbolic circuitry. You can't be hitting this deep subcortical stuff with money. Money is a secondary incentive, right? It's not a primary incentive. You should be using juice. And it's like, well, there it is. That's the activation, and money is doing it. So I think it suggests we need to think about, basically, the neuroscience can reconfigure our theories and can select out the theories that can really describe what we're responding to. Now, what you're talking about is like, I would love to have, by the way, is a series of probes. Like we have this one silly probe, right? It's a really dumb task that people get engaged in, and it activates their brain with money. But what if you had that for social stimuli? What if you had that for status-related stimuli? What if you had that for learning? What if you had those kind of probes for all kinds of things? And then what if you could do manipulations or interventions and see how priorities shift? Like even, if people have kids, look at their responses to babies before and after. I'm sure that would change. So, the sky is really the limit. But I do think that we're limited by the technology, and we're limited by our own preconceptions about the limits of the systems. So I have a long wish list and a short set of findings that I think we can claim in the last 10 years. And I think we need those probes actually to answer the questions that you're asking.
So one thing I was trying to bring this back to part of the point of the conference, behavior change, and it seems like trying to bring your two talks together too. A lot of what you're talking about is anticipation and maybe problems with like a proper estimate of the probability of your success or something like that, and maybe that's a target or a place for intervention. I don't know if you guys you've sort of started talking about that, but maybe specific things about like teaching people to better estimate their probability or things like that. I don't know if you guys can talk about that or some more along the lines of trying to change that area.
So in education, especially in third world countries, it's a big issue of people not knowing how valuable education would be, and teaching them that actually you see behavioral changes. Now, it seems to be less of an issue in the US or Western Europe, where people have pretty good ideas about how valuable education is. So I think we didn't find a big effect of confidence, so I would not expect these differences to come from not knowing the value of the education. So it suggests that there are other traits that might be, unfortunately less easy to fix, I guess. If I can just tell you, you're going to lose out on being able to study engineering, and we say, yeah, I think they know that. And they kind of don't care in a certain sense. So that's the problem.
Part of the value of education is also how well they'll do there. So if they think they're going to do well versus they think they're not going to do well, that changes the value.
So that's something we don't know yet, how all these super competitive boys who took the math track and who actually were not that good in math. The question is, are they going to flounder, or are they actually going to be just working hard and then making it? And the other problem is, how about these non-competitive girls who actually chose a math track? Now, they went from a class of like normal kids to hyper-competitive classmates. So the question is, maybe suddenly being competitive is going to be an even more important trait, because otherwise you're just not going to survive in that environment. So these are, we just really start just asking these questions. I think we just really don't know that much yet.
I'll just say a brief thing, and then, so one thing we've learned from our very few studies is that what motivates people is not necessarily the sure thing. So, that kind of violates expected value, right? If I give you 100% of having $5 versus 50% of chance of having $5 after doing something, I would think that you would be more excited about the first thing than the second thing. That's not necessarily what we see in brain activation. That's not necessarily even what we see if we probe people in affective self-report. And so it's an interesting proposition to think about incentivizing from that framework. So how could you fold these two things? How could you improve the way we incentivize things? And people have talked about this from the standpoint of games and how you construct engaging games. And what if we thought about education as we think about games? So which means that we're not just thinking about the incentives, but we're thinking about the delivery of the incentives and the dynamics over time. And I think this whole new frontier, again, I don't have really anything really profound to say about that, except it may be that we need to reconsider how we think about incentives and be more specific about time. So I think it ties in what you're saying. Emily was going to say something, sorry.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to think about it. I feel like we've said a number of times sort of as a granted today that maybe we should, there are good decision makers and bad decision makers, or maybe we should make people better at being able to estimate their probabilities of success. And so I just wanted to throw in the social psychologist perspective here for a second, which is that that's not a fixed thing, right? That it's not that there are good decision makers and bad decision makers, or that, we should make you better at estimating your probability of success, because your probability of success is highly contingent on the way you think about it and about a lot of institutional features, right? And so there's a ton of social psychological research ranging from, the work that you guys are probably familiar with on stereotype threat and on people's, the way they conceptualize whether, when you get out of school, right? If you show women earnings versus if you show them the rates of who finishes school, you get different performance on tests, right? And so the way that you frame problems and also the way that you frame the experience of the problems matters. So there's other data that show that if you have an experience of a challenging, say, math problem, and then you frame that difficulty in terms of, that means that it's really important, then people will persist on the task. But if you frame it as basically you're not good at this, then people don't persist on the task. And so, right, a lot of this comes down to things which are not fixed, and where I don't know. We've sort of made this assumption, it seems like a few times about the stability of people's behavior or preferences or ability to learn. And then just as a separate thing about the STEM fields question, I was wondering about there's separately research about role models and about the institutional factors that you've touched on a little bit. But I was also wondering to what extent you think the order of prestige has to do with the fact that more men go into these fields and they're more vocal about it. So that, like Brian was just saying about things that are socially constructed, right? Like that we say that this is more valuable versus this other thing is more valuable. Like it doesn't seem to me to be an inherent feature of the disciplines.
Okay, so two answers, I guess, to two questions. So the first one, so I agree. I can probably, within an experiment, manipulate a little bit, maybe even quite a lot. I don't know how competitive you are by framing things differently. So one way I think of this second study where I show this correlation between my little lab measure and the field is that it actually also validates the specific measure I used, because otherwise I wouldn't have found this correlation. And I'm at least, maybe I should be, but at least right now I'm actually not worried that my one class, 45-minute intervention had really an impact on what they're going to do at the end of June. So maybe that's a bit naive, but at least that was my working assumption. Now I think it is interesting to think about maybe I can, so Carol Dweck, who is not far from where I am, the question is maybe if I tell people that, being good in math is not about genetics, but about working hard, maybe I could change some of these choices. And that would be also interesting to study. But I guess here the focus was more on, to be honest, a little bit was on validating my measure and trying to understand what's happening there. But I think thinking about changing the way we view things and frame things and showing the impact of that, I think that's also interesting. So I don't... I think there are lots of interesting questions. I think it's there's lots of room to do things. Yeah.
That was, it was more about kind of whether we make an assumption about these things being fixed or being malleable that social psychologists have a slightly different maybe set of starting assumptions.
Yeah, so it is. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say you have to measure something; it has to be reliable. So the irony of that is to show change, you have to have a reliable measure. So, you need both. I think we would assume both. I think both are valuable. And I don't think just because you're measuring something that's reliable, that means that it doesn't change.
Right, so ideally, I have reliability for 2 years, but if I have an intervention, maybe I could change it, right? So, but we are just so far from this. But I think it would be very nice. And I forgot your second question, which was... I had an interesting comment, but I don't...
Sorry.
What was the second question? What was the second question? You have like a one...
It was about sort of a speculative question about, you showed very nicely that there are these stable views, or at least...
Oh, perfect. Yes. Yeah. So when you think about... the second track, the biology track, actually has more women than men. And nonetheless, it's the second most prestigious track. So there are a lot of people who go there would either become doctors or nurses. So you can guess who is becoming what. I think it might be correlated with this. It is amazing that we always, everywhere have the same view. On the other hand, one reason to focus on math is that it is actually the case that if I take one of your high school classes, the grade, and check which one is going to be predictive for your success or your earnings in the future, it is not going to be the English class. It is going to be the math class and the science class. Now, it turns out to be also the foreign language class, but I don't know how much it is US specific because you guys don't all do foreign languages, so maybe that has a different predictive power. I don't know that. So I don't know whether that holds in Europe. But the strength of the math being predictive for future earnings that's why we focus on math.
As you feel.
The absence of something good is not the same as the presence of something bad, right?
That's what we think.
Yeah. So, how do you think this if you use presence or absence of aversive stimuli, what would you see across the lifespan, instead of like loss or gain of money?
That's a good question. I don't know. I'm working with a postdoc, Katja Spreckelmeyer, who developed a social version of our monetary incentive delay task. And so I think she has looked at older people with that task. And I'm trying to remember what she found. Because I think she compared money, like anticipatory activity for monetary reward and for smiling social reward. And she saw a shift towards more anticipatory ventral striatal activity for the social reward versus monetary. But I don't think she looked at like negative faces or some negative stimulus. So I don't have a good prediction about that. And to be quite honest, I wish we had better neural markers for anticipation of aversive stimuli. I mean, we see the kinds of things you might expect from pain studies, right? When people anticipate pain, you often see anterior insula activation, anterior cingulate activation, so the pain matrix. But it also seems to be active when they anticipate reward in our paradigms. So that's a little bit of a, for us, the gain anticipation signals are much more prominent than the loss anticipation signals, contrary to what we expected going into this research. So there are some mysteries we need to resolve, even in young people. But just to add one more thing, one more thought about that, there's an interesting question. If we have replicated that effect in older people, that there's just less activity when they anticipate loss in their brain, and they report less anxiety. And it's an interesting question, like even if that's true, what's causing it, right? So is it the case that they have some top-down regulatory strategy that might even be implicit? I mean, that may be true. That Laura Carstensen actually thinks that's the case. Another possibility is they've just burnt out their locus ceruleus and they don't have much norepinephrine throughput, I don't want to believe that, but it could be true too, because major trajectories of locus ceruleus norepinephrine neurons run through the anterior insula and through the anterior cingulate and not to the ventral striatum. So there's a whole lot we need to figure out about actually what's neurochemically causing the bold signals that we're seeing in fMRI. So we're actually exploring doing that in rats, but that's a whole different topic.
So we actually have to wrap up the discussion. Just want to give a hand in with you guys. So just two quick announcements. We're going to have a bunch of really wonderful posters that you should all come and see in the gallery over there. And also tomorrow the conference will be upstairs, just a reminder.
We have one other special announcement.
Special announcement.
Which even you don't know about.
Okay.
This is very important principle. As you know, tomorrow's economist got caught by the weather, and we've been feeling badly about it and starting to get really blue. And then we thought, well, we have an economist part of our planning group, and he's been thinking about these issues for a while, and he's been picking on everybody else. So, this would be a great chance to pick back. So, very graciously, Shachar has offered to stand in tomorrow. We don't have the exact title yet, but now we do. It's being invented, but he gave a talk at IPSR earlier, and it was very, very interesting on these topics. So I know it would be a nice way to have that represented. So we're going to go back to our original schedule for tomorrow. And if you show up at 8 o'clock, there'll be a continental breakfast, and then we'll herd you into our less opulent room, which doesn't reflect on tomorrow's speakers, but reflects on the budgetary realities. And then we'll have 3 talks tomorrow and then a panel. So it should be a great day. And then at the end of the day, we're going to have a brainstorming session, which will be sort of a fishbowl, and everybody's invited to attend. We'll have all of our speakers and all of our BCRN people talking about how to really catalyze this kind of science and intervention work at Berkeley. And that sort of ends our day tomorrow. So you're now invited to the poster session, and you'll see some really interesting work from some of our Berkeley graduate students and postdocs in this area. And tonight we have a gathering for our speakers, a little dinner, and those of you who aren't attending that, we'll see you in the posters and then hopefully again in the morning. Thank you for a really lovely day.